Hello gamers, Powered Heal here, and today we're going to be talking about Innervate. So, somebody had asked probably like 3 or 4 days ago when the Druid, how to play Druid guide is coming. And I felt a little bad because I remember that we did a bunch of Druid content, but we didn't really actually do like the comprehensive how to play Druid guide. And so yeah, that is on the horizon. And this will be talked about in that guide, because obviously we're going to go over Innervate, but I felt like this kind of deserves its own standalone video as well. And I'll probably do another video on Innervate in terms of kind of dispelling some misconceptions about it, but that's going to be its own video. So that one's going to be about which class should you use it on, or like when should you use it, kind of like how effective it is on various classes, because I think the obvious answer is like Priest, you know what I mean, is the class it's most effective on, but I think a lot of people have a fundamental misunderstanding of how Innervate works, and they tend to think that it's like completely useless to use on another class, and I would say it's sort of situational. Kind of depends on exactly the circumstances, even though, yeah, most of the time you're going to want to be using it on a Priest, so I was going to make a video kind of going over the mechanics of Innervate. But this video is kind of going to be a primer on how to use Innervate in regards to something we talked about when we were doing the Druid content. If you remember back from the Hot videos that I put out, I had some pretty strong opinions on Hots, and that drew out some pretty strong opinions in response from some of our Druid friends, right? And a major kind of point of contention, I think, between me and the Druid players, although I don't even want to frame it like that, because I'm a Druid player as well, you know, like I've played Druid in every form of Classic. I've had a Resto Druid, right? So it's not like I'm a Priest homer, you know, and I hate Druids or anything like that. It's just my observation of having played all the classes, right? I've definitely played Priests more. I've had more like alt Priests especially than I've had alt Druids. But the reason why I have more alt priests is because I just feel like they are more useful, right? Like if I thought Druid was more useful, I would have more alt Druids. But anyway, during that video where we talked about Hots, people were basically saying like, well, you know, why should I be a second class citizen and not even be able to use my own spell that God, aka Blizzard, gave me? You know, this is my spell. I should be able to use it on myself. Why do I have to give it away? Doesn't make any sense. I can top the charts with this. And I kind of wanted to just make a video explaining why I think you should pretty much always give your Innervate on Druid, right? And I'll basically kind of go back to what people were saying about the meters kind of overall, right? Because one of the big arguments from that video is I can beat Priests if I use Innervate. Now, it's a little bit unclear, in my opinion, the exact context of the statement. I feel like most likely what they mean by this is that they beat Priests on any given fight, let's say, right? So maybe they beat a Priest on Thaddeus, or maybe they beat a Priest on a Nubercon or Nubarak, right? I think that's, yeah, Nubercon, I think, is the one from Trial of the Grand Crusade. I always get those two confused. But you kind of get the point, is they're talking about on a specific encounter. And because this was a big thing that was kind of linked to me after that video of the Hots, is like, well, look at these parses from Druids and Nax, right? They're using Hots here, and look, they're beating Priests on some of these fights, right? They have higher HPS than Priests. And my whole thing with this is that the only thing that I think matters, and I think this is a pretty reasonable statement to make, but the only type of healing and healing parses that even matter remotely, like at all, are overall, right? So the amount of healing you've done throughout the entire dungeon, and like how much of that, you know, is like effective healing, how much of that is overhealing. Like in some cases, more overhealing is okay, right? Like not necessarily all overhealing is bad overhealing. I'll probably make a video on that as well, about the overhealing, and then I'll also make a video about like the parsing situation, why I believe overall is important. But the gist of it is that the fights in this game are so short, and there's almost never a point in time where you are concerned about not having, the mana or the ability to get through a fight. Right? Typically, when you wipe in this game, it's due to mechanic checks, right? So it's very possible to wipe on a fight like Noth the Plaguebringer or something like that if you don't do the mechanics of the fight, but you're not going to really wipe because the fight was like too difficult in terms of like taxing you or your mana or anything like that. So this idea that we really should be caring about the overall heal output at any given fight is kind of a joke in my opinion. In most cases, what's going to determine who's parsing what on a fight is what role they have, how much mana they went into the fight with is going to be kind of the biggest thing. And, are they actually trying to parse in that fight is actually a big one, right? Because you're going to play differently if you're trying to parse than if you're not trying to parse. And Druid has kind of a unique advantage when they're wanting to parse in that they can actually, use these hots that they have as kind of like background healing. So basically, they can have stuff that's always ticking all the time, and they can have it ticking even on what I would say or consider to be non-crucial targets, right? So it basically just gives Druid another layer of HPS to add on in the background, which is why you can sometimes see them like pull ahead of priests on any given fight, right? Because they essentially have access to more ticks of healing. They also have things like Swiftmen, which can be really powerful, right? So when you factor kind of on all these things together, like if you go into a fight that's like a, let's say 30-second to 1 minute fight, and you have your healing touch up, right? Or sorry, not your healing touch, but your nature swiftness up. You have Swiftmend up, right, at the start of the fight. So let's say you go into the fight, you put hots in the tank, you're putting hots on some of the people that are taking damage, or anticipating damage coming out, okay? You're spamming regrowth on the targets that, get kind of like chunked a little bit. And then you are swift mending maybe one of those targets or one of the tanks that is taking a big chunk of damage, so you're kind of sniping the damage into them there. Then you're reapplying the hot, whatever one it consumed. And then another time you are, casting that huge nature swiftness on like a tank or some other target. If you unload all these cooldowns in a very short period of time, you are going to do a lot of work, and you stand a chance to post like a really high parse. So it doesn't surprise me, and it never surprised me that Druid could potentially beat Priest on any given fight, right? Especially when you're dealing with something like Warcraft logs, where the idea is that, you're compiling pretty much every Druid that's going to raid, right? So if you have a bunch of Druids that are trying to produce this effect, you are going to get a Druid that actually succeeds. It reminds me of Battlefield 6 is out, and there's this controversy that's going on with like cheating in the game because this clip got released where people are thinking this person cheated, and it's people just really don't realize how people that are kind of posting these types of clips, they're actually trying to do something almost like completely foreign to actually winning the game, right? Like they're essentially going out and specifically trying to farm clips that look outrageous, not necessarily for rage bait, just to be like, wow, look at that, like crazy aim or whatever, right? And when you're doing things like that, you're playing differently than you would if you're trying to like win the game necessarily or play optimally. And this is kind of like the same thing in WoW with parsing, right? So yeah, it doesn't surprise me that Druids oftentimes have the upper hand there in some regards. But overall, in the scope of the entire instance, Druids are typically, and I would say almost never, beating priests, right? So, and I mean, you can pretty much look into any like top logs and confirm that, right? And I actually did this. It was funny when I was having that kind of like debate with people in the comment section on the Druid videos, because they were obviously very adamant the druids were out healing priests. So I go and I look, and like I said, it was like on a fight for fight basis, and I would go and look at Nax and AQ for like druids, seeing how many of them are like at the top of their guild's respective overall healing logs, right? And at the very top, there's none, right? Which is obvious, and that's the main point I was making, is playing the druid optimally. You're not going to be near the top of the meter. But then even when you had druids that were like clearly trying to play as main healer, there were very few of them that like ever beat or topped over their priests, and the ones that did all used Innervate on themselves from what I saw. So I went out and then like verified this information, because I'm always open, right? If people post something in the comments that's like contradictory to what I'm saying, to go check it out. In this case, I don't think it's necessarily that they were wrong. Like I'm saying, they just have a different thought process of what quote unquote winning or outperforming is, because they're viewing it on a fight by fight basis. But yeah, most raids in Classic are just not run on a fight by fight basis, right? The idea is like you get into the raid and you pretty much go, right? Because the content is so easy that, like I said, we're not really worried about what's going on in any given fight. We're worried about how efficient can you be over the entire, 35, 40-minute AQ run. How efficient can you be over the entire 25-minute Molten Core? How efficient can you be over the hour 20 Nax or whatever it's going to be? So when you look into things in that way, it's unanimously priest across the board. And so then the question obviously comes like, well, if a druid is like barely competing with priest, okay, on overall, and in most cases like losing to priest, let's be frank, then why should they get the Innervate, right? Like how does that make sense? Because basically what you're saying is, if they're using Innervates, like let's say you have a priest or a druid that's close to your priest on any given overall sample from, like, let's say an AQ 40 or something like that, and this druid is within, like, let's say a couple percent of the priest, but he used, like, let's say 3 Innervates, or actually it's gonna be more than that, right? A 6-minute cooldown. Let's say he used like 6 Innervates, or yeah, I think that's probably reasonable. 6 or 7, maybe 8, I guess, if you want to have this be not a super fast AQ run, right? So like 6 to 8 Innervates. So if it took him 6 to 8 Innervates to still lose to the priest in overall, right, or barely beat the priest, or come in very close with the priest, then how can you say that the Innervate is then better on the druid? Because we know if he would have given the Innervate to the priest, he could have went even harder, right, than he did. Generally speaking, like, maybe the priest isn't going to be able to use all 8 Innervates, right? Because, like, a druid can kind of go through mana faster than a priest, especially if they're relying heavily on regrowth. I mean, in my opinion, there's a lot of overhealing down there that tends to be wasted. However, there could be situations where maybe your priest doesn't actually need to spend as much mana, right? And your druid is leaning more into regrowth for whatever reason, and using the Innervate on himself in that particular situation is actually more beneficial than using on the priest. It's not an inconceivable thing, right? But the problem is it's not going to be every Innervate, right? The priest is going to want an Innervate in AQ 40. They're going to want an Innervate even in Blackwing Lair. They're going to want an Innervate in Nax. So there's going to be times where your priests definitely do want that Innervate and would benefit from having it. So there's no reason to essentially use it on yourself, right? If you're barely equaling their healing, their throughput, or slightly worse than it over the course of the entire instance. So that's kind of point number 1. Now, point number 2, which I feel like is kind of like the... I tried to point this out in the comment section and didn't really seem to connect so well. So I kind of thought of another analogy here to bring to the table. And I think this should kind of, make things like really, really crystal clear. So the big argument is kind of like, well, this is part of my kit as a druid. So if it's part of my kit, then why am I having to give it to someone else? Like, it's not fair. Like, they basically just didn't even engage with the argument of the fact that clearly it's, like, more efficient to use on the priest, right? If they're doing more healing equivalent or even a little bit less healing with, like, 6 to 8 less innervates, then clearly it's more efficient to use in the priest. They didn't even engage with that at all. They were just coming at it from the perspective of, well, this belongs to my class. How are you telling me that I can't use my class ability on myself? It's like, well, first of all, I'm not actually telling you what you can and cannot do, right? Like, you can play the game however you want. But the whole point of the video is I'm just telling you, obviously, what is, like, the most efficient thing to do and how to play, right? And would be presumably the reason why you clicked on this video, because that was essentially the whole point of the video. But regardless, that's kind of like their argument. So my thought process is to go into something else that is kind of proprietary to a class, but is typically outsourced to another class for the greater good of the raid. And that is the good old Power Infusion. So Power Infusion, super common. Most priests are spec PI, which I think is fine, by the way. I remember I had one video where I talked about spiritual guidance, because I was giving data on spiritual guidance, like what the spirit, like kind of like how your spirit contributes to spiritual guidance if you are the spiritual guidance spec. And people are just, like, flaming hardcore. They're like, I can't believe you're not PI. So yeah, I'm not hating on PI, guys. The PI spec is absolutely fine. It's definitely the predominant spec. I can make a video on what I think about PI and how it compares to the other spec specifically, but like I said, it's more than fine. But anyways, this is typically, something that you go on priest, and it's for the exclusive benefit of the mage, right? You don't go PI to PI yourself. You go PI to give your PI to a mage. And it's interesting because for the priest, PI can actually be used on themselves. And I'm sure if you're a priest, you're aware of this, right? Especially if you're a discipline, you're out in the world PvPing, PI yourself, Mind Blast, Smite, whatever. You can use it to snapshot for dots and stuff like that. So priests are very well aware they can use this cooldown themselves. They can increase their throughput, but why don't they? They always outsource it to the mage, okay? It's because they realize that the spell is going to have more effect on the mage, right? They don't really need that extra bit of plus healing. They can kind of adjust with ranks if they really did need more throughput in some cases. There's almost no case where, like, you desperately need like that amount of throughput and you don't have access to it, right? You pretty much just rank up your spell. And mages do more damage with the PI, especially now that they're Ignite. I think how much this actually contributes to the overall damage of the raid is still a bit overrated, in the sense that people think that it's more than it is, but it is definitely now more substantial than it was. And even in the past, when they were using Frostbolt, it was still substantial, at least for the mage themselves, right? Even if on the overall, it's not having that big of an effect. So we routinely do this for something that actually matters even less, right? Like, priests are basically told all the time, and it's expected and customary for them to give over their PIs for something that I would say, like I said, matters even less, because, does it really matter if your mage is doing a little bit more damage? No, it matters who gets the Innervate. That's a way more consequential ability usage than which mage gets the PI, or do they get the PI timing perfect or something like that. Not only this, but priest actually has to go into discipline and invest in PI to get it. And when they get PI specifically, they can't get something like spiritual guidance, which actually turns out to be around like 70 to 100 healing. Especially at this point in the game, it's actually very easy to get like 500 spirit which is basically 125 extra plus healing. So you're kind of getting almost like another weapon's worth of healing if you neglect going PI in favor of the Holy/Dis hybrid build. And you still see priests going PI. And they're going PI not to PI themselves, they're going PI to PI their friends. So what I kind of want to ask the Druid players who are like really, really selfish with their Innervate is like, why is there this expectation on priests to give away their PI, and you don't think you should be doing the same thing essentially for the betterment of the raid, right? It doesn't really make sense to me. The same logic should be applied in both cases. So I think that's basically the main point I want to make, is just that it's very common in a game like this when you have an external, right, that you're going to use it on the class that benefits the most from having that external. It's kind of been like this pretty much forever. Throughout the history of the game, there's been tons of various, buffs like tricks of the trade and things like that. And if you're actually trying to, have a successful raid, you're pretty much using them where you think they'll be most effective. And I think another thing that really contributes to this is kind of like the third point, I guess, is the whole parsing culture, right? Where the idea is that people want to hold this cooldown because they feel like it helps them compete on the nebulous healing parsing meters for Druid. And if they don't use this cooldown themselves, well then, they just don't stand a chance against the Druid who's innervating themselves 6 to 8 times. And I understand this kind of like the pressure, almost like the peer pressure of this, but I really think that it would just be so beneficial if you guys could just let that go. I know it's kind of hard, but I would put it like this. Try and just compete within your own raid, right? Like, don't care what other Druid on Warcraft logs is doing, how much healing he's doing on a given fight, how much healing he's doing on overall even. Like why do we have to care about this? You're in a different raid, different circumstances, and if you kind of just focus on doing your job properly, then none of this really matters. Like, you never really see me, like, ever pull up my Warcraft logs, right, and sit back and look and be like, oh, wow, I got a 99 on this boss, man. That's, like, if anything, like, I don't even think I've pulled it up once when I've ever been on stream or anything, but if I would have, it'd be to kind of, I'd probably just look at it, and if I had a 99 somewhere, I'd be like, oh, that's interesting, right? Then it must have been a lucky, things kind of came together on that particular pull. And that happens sometimes. Like, I've had, like, Shazara pulls early on that have almost been close to, like, a rank 1 parse with the pre-shielding and stuff like that. And that's basically just how I look at it. So that's funny, that it worked out like that. But there's just no point in kind of getting yourself really absorbed or worked up by comparing yourself against other people, especially in healing, right? It's just like in healing, it's so subjective, and it's just kind of like completely pointless. And I think it would just be so much easier if you just like compared yourself to other people in the raid. And the thing is too is like that way you know the sensible limitations. So for example, like if you PI this priest 4 times in your raid, then it's unreasonable to expect to even be close to him on the healing meter, right? Obviously, because you're giving him your your Innervate, right? So obviously, yeah, you're not going to be competing with this guy. And I think like having that mindset of competing within your own zone is just like way healthier, makes things way easier, and it's going to make your raids way smoother, right? Because you're not trying to do something that's sort of like out of band for your class, if that makes sense. I think a really good example, just a little bit from my own gameplay, is you'll notice when I do MC on the stream or whatever, I'm typically like top the spells in the Molten Core. At least usually in the early part at least. Sometimes people start to dispel a bunch of stuff that doesn't really matter all that much towards the later part of the instance. But when we're talking about relevant dispels, I think I have the lion's share. And it's kind of something like I take pride in almost. It doesn't really show up. There's no dispel parsing meter thing on Warcraft logs, that's like how many dispels did you get or anything like that. But the idea is I don't want to have like a high overall and be completely neglecting dispels, right? Because to me, that sort of almost like cheapens the overall, like having the high overall anyway, right? It doesn't really make sense to me to like, it's like we're going to completely neglect our responsibilities every week to like cheese on this meter, Like to me, what I want to do is I want to make sure we take care of all the bases that we should be taking care of, i.e. dispels and everything else that should go on, and then we worry about how much output, right? So it's like the whole idea is like I did this much healing in spite of the fact that I was also top dispels, right? And you can kind of be like that on Druid as well. You can be like, I did this much healing, while getting all these Fairy Fires out. Like I get them out instantly. I had this pack basically Fairy Fired up like before people even made contact on the 4th mob or whatever. And the boss had 100% uptime on my Fairy Fire all the time. It never fell off. And I innervated. I did this healing without using any innervates at all. I gave all my innervates away. And I'm still doing this much healing. Like, that's kind of like the mentality I like to have when I play Druid. And also when I play Priest, it's kind of like that, but like I said, with the dispels and things of that sort. So we're never trying to neglect like one responsibility to just prop ourselves up on the other end of the spectrum, right? To me, that's pointless because everybody knows, like, it's actually so obvious if you just pull up even the overall stats in like one of these, right? Where it's like, yeah, if you never cast Cure Poison as a Druid, you're going to have higher healing. But, you also probably just could have did the raid a lot better by casting those Cure Poisons. I see this all the time in AQ40, even on the places where it matters, right? On the bugs, where the poisons actually one-shot you if you don't get them off. I see Druids not even, putting Abolish Poison on the targets who have Itch to try and get like a tick perfect to get the poison cleansed immediately. Because a lot of times you'll have multiple Itch targets. So, I don't know, I see that type of behavior a lot. And like I said, it's the same thing with the Priest. Like, does it really matter if you're number 1 overall on healing if you've basically casted like no dispels throughout the entire run, right? To me, it doesn't. Like, I just look at that and I laugh. It's like, yeah, of course you should be there because the other guy is like casting like 50 to 100 dispels a raid, So yeah, I don't know. Like, don't get caught up in parsing. Don't get caught up in any of this other like stuff that doesn't matter, right? And I'm not saying that you always have to give your Innervate, right? Like, they're like I was saying before, there could very well be times where the priests are actually good on mana for whatever reason, and you've had to spend mana for whatever reason, whether it be a mistake or whether it be through just legitimate use of that mana. Maybe you're the best player, right? And you do actually do a lot of healing. There's definitely reasons why you would innervate yourself. So I'm not saying you never innervate yourself, but this idea that the innervate should always be yours because it's on your class bar is just absurd, right? Because other classes give other classes buffs when they have them. Priest being, the primary example. And like I said, Priest has to invest more to give that buff than Druid does. So yeah, just some food for thought. As we kind of go into the Druid videos, there's probably going to be a Paladin and a Priest video coming out over the next few days during AQ40, and then I'm looking to get the Druid video out fairly soon. The Druid video is just going to be, it's taking a little bit because it's just a lot. There's kind of like 4 distinct playstyles, and even though I'm going to suggest to you the one that I think is best, I still want to cover the other playstyles because I think most of them at least have a place somewhere, and it's worth having them in your consciousness, even if I think that in most cases, kind of like the swift mend, sparse healing style tends to be best. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope I kind of got my point across better this time on why you should give your Innervate in most circumstances. And yeah, thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe if this helped, and talk to you guys later.